Hello. I hope you enjoy the lunch break. I want to actually introduce Jarno properly. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jarno Elovirta. And also wake you up a bit.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Sorry for.
Is there going to be a meet and greet later on?
Yes, please. So sorry for being late. I had to pop by to see myself in the mirror, whether to wear the cap or not. So it took me a while. It's difficult to decide what you want to wear in front of people. So I wanted to talk about the Markdown support in Open Toolkit. Not from the perspective of is lightweight DITA good for me or authors or subject matter experts in writing documentation, rather about how we introduced it into Open Toolkit processing flow and sort of how it works, and then some whining. So I'm still Jarno Elovirta. I still write programs. I have absolutely nothing to do with the lightweight DITA subcommittee of the DITA-TC. I occasionally talk with Carlos or someone else who's present there. I occasionally review the things that they produce, namely the lightweight DITA note, community note, what's it called? Someone knows. Committee note. So I occasionally review these things, but I'm not associated with them. That's my sort of declaration. So I started to work on Open Toolkit a long time ago, and then at some point I thought, yes, we could actually introduce Markdown as an input format. Lightweight DITA at the time was probably somewhere on Michael's laptop, but it wasn't sort of formally defined anywhere, maybe in talks or somewhere. So I started to work a couple of years ago. I think the first commit for the plugin was from 2015, so it's a fairly new thing. So I thought I'd talk about bananas, and this is a box of bananas. Because some people are really attached to superficial things like boxes or markup languages. So we'll start from there. This is some content. It's written in Markdown or Common Mark or GitHub flavor of Markdown or some other flavor of Markdown. We don't really know, and I don't know if we actually need to care. And here's some XML alongside of it. The two files look superficially completely different. There's nothing similar about them. One has lots of angled brackets and the other one has a bit more white space. But the actual content is the same. And if you're a programmer and you look at these two documents, if you can find a way to parse these documents, meaning separate the structures that define the markup language and then separate it from the content, there's probably a way of mapping those two formats into each other, basically doing save as or import as operations. So syntax of a document or Markdown allows us to associate semantics with the content. And Markdown is a markup language, and it has fixed syntax in the sense that some things start with a hash symbol, and we have a fixed semantic for that, which is this is the start of a first line header. The same with if a line starts with a asterisk, followed by 3 spaces, followed by something. That's a list item. So there's a clear and fixed semantic associated with that syntax. And in a way, Markdown is unextensible, whereas XML promised us an extensible markup language. But it's extending things at the level of semantics, but it doesn't allow you to extend the syntax itself. With XML, you can't introduce a new element type that starts with is it a corner bracket? XML doesn't allow that type of extension. It only allows you to sort of modify and extend the semantics, and you still need to use the exact same underlying syntax. And if you want to have elements that start with some other character, there's always HTML for that. There's probably a reason why we moved away from HTML, because most people actually don't want to change the syntax. They're okay with extending the semantics. In Open Toolkit, we take DITA-XML. I don't know what it should be called. It used to be called just DITA, but now we have to actually say DITA-XML or XML DITA. So we take DITA and we convert it or publish it, transform it into, for example, HTML5. And when you do that, you actually strip out a lot of the semantics that exist in the document. So there's an author. She spends 4 weeks crafting these wonderful topics, painstakingly adding semantic markup there, and then along comes someone who needs to publish it into their website, strips out all the semantics, and everything is bold. Wonderful. So you could say Open Toolkit is simplifying or removing all the hard work that people have put into their documents. And you could think of converting Markdown into DITA is doing similar type of mapping that you would do when you convert DITA-XML into HTML, for example. Maybe a better example would be trough. You take a DITA element and then you convert it into some other syntax. The content is still the same. So if Open Toolkit can do that, at the end of the publishing cycle, the final result is some other language. Why can't it do it right in the beginning of the processing phase? The difference there is, instead of stripping out the semantics and making everything bold, maybe you could add a CSS class, but basically in publishing to HTML, we're stripping out all the semantics. When we convert DITA-XML into Markdown, we need to actually retain all the semantics as far as possible. We try to convert it without losing anything. Of course, that's not always possible because there may be some constructs in Markdown, for example, that don't have an equivalent representation in DITA. That's a case where you can't do one-to-one markings, one-to-one mapping, so you have to throw something away. But in most cases, because Markdown is hideously simple, we can do that. Internally, Open Toolkit uses XML as like an internal representation format. It doesn't have to do it, but it's just convenient to use the same format as what the input is. If we were to read in, for example, binary files, it might make sense to represent them in a file format that isn't binary, easier to debug. So we already use DITA-XML as the internal structure. Well, there's some additional runtime attributes that we add, but it's basically the same as the XML we usually consume. So it doesn't really matter what your cat looks like. The most important thing is what's inside. So you don't have to think that one markup language is better than the other one. In the end, they're all the same. It's the content that really matters. One thing to note is that lightweight DITA isn't a specification yet. I don't know if the actual node is out yet.
Very close.
Very close. It's very close, but being very close means it's not ready.
The reviews are done now, it just needs to be published. So it's closer than very close.
Okay, and it's not done yet.
Yes, it's not published.
Okay, and this is a note. If you read the note, and I hope everyone already has read the note, it's fairly high level, and it doesn't go into implementation. It doesn't go into implementation details. So it leaves a lot to be deduced or guessed. But we already have now something that is similar to a spec. So there's something that we can try and start to implement. The MDITA, meaning the Markdown format of DITA, it's a subset of Markdown. I think that's the way it goes. And what it does is it adds DITA semantics to Markdown structures. For example, if you have a top-level H1 header in Markdown, we map it into a DITA title. Or if we have a paragraph in Markdown, we mark it into a DITA paragraph. A paragraph doesn't have that much semantic meaning to it. It's actually quite void of any deep meaning. But that's how the mapping works. And a lightweight DITA has sort of two profiles. I think they're called profiles for Markdown support. The other one is the more extensive one, where you can use language features that not every Markdown parser, for example, will support. But they want to have that extended profile because plain markup is really, really simple. So when we take Markdown, map it into DITA, the mapping isn't really arbitrary. It's not randomly generated, but it's just one mapping. Alternative mappings can be created. Now we have a bunch of people with some authority of saying this is the specification, but remember there can be alternative mappings to DITA. I'm not suggesting that there should be 2 or 3 groups that fight among each other. Who's the most correct mapping, but there are alternative ones. And we actually support 2 different mappings. MDITA basically uses all the features of Markdown. There's a mapping for everything. But due to how DITA in some cases restricts the structure, we can't allow everything that is allowed by Markdown to be convertible into DITA. For example, the order of things. In Markdown, it's a completely valid Markdown file. It starts with a paragraph, and then you have a, for example, 3rd level heading. That's something you can't describe in DITA, especially if you want to somehow map it into the DITA proper, the XML format. The same is with like nesting headers. You can't have a 1st level heading followed by a 3rd level heading. What happened to the 2nd one? Well, I don't know. Markdown allows this. DITA doesn't. So it's a subset. We have an alternative mapping in addition to the lightweight DITA one. I didn't come up with a name for it. Roger called it Markdown, so that's what we're going with. So we have MDITA and Markdown mappings to DITA. The difference between these 2 mappings is that the alternative format, the alternative to lightweight DITA, it allows headers to use these so-called header attributes. that are part of, I think, PHP's flavor of Markdown. And it allows you to specify classes and IDs for headers, something that lightweight DITA itself doesn't allow you to do. Which in turn allows you to use multiple levels of nesting within a topic. So it allows topics inside topics, which then in turn contains sections, whereas lightweight DITA only supports a single level of topics that may contain sections. There's really no reason for the restriction that a lightweight DITA has for this. But then again, I'm not an author. So it might be a really good idea from the perspective of authors that you don't give them too much features of the language that they can start then abusing. And then there's a additional complication. Markdown allows nested HTML inside it. So what Markdown itself is already doing, it allows you to merge two different languages which are completely different. One uses angle brackets, one uses white space and leading characters. So when you think of Markdown as a language, it's awful. It's clearly been designed to fulfill a need and be really practical. But then when you start to create a strict spec for it, things become obvious that it's not that good of a language, in my opinion. So I'll quickly go through the idea of how do we do the mapping process just for the fun of it. So when DITA starts to process something, it starts with the pre-process. It reads, parses, and stores files into the temporary directory as files. So OpenToolkit has an extension point where you can give it alternative parsers to read the files in. So the default one is an XML parser because it's assuming that everything it consumes is XML. But sometimes you can give it an alternative parser, and in this case it's based on the format attribute that maps have. So we can specify that we have format equals mdita, and that's when we switch into a different type of parser. So when the parser accepts the file or reads the file, it first tokenizes the character string or the file, chops it into pieces, and then constructs what's called an abstract syntax tree. This is fairly common terminology in computer science or programming. And there's nothing special about it. It's really easy to take something like this into use. And this is something that is done also for XML. The parsers used to parse XML work almost exactly the same way. So then we get into the stage where the magic happens. We take the AST, the abstract syntax tree, and we map it or convert it into a DOM object, document object model. In reality, we don't actually do it. We convert it into a SAC stream, but this is easier to draw. So this is where we can actually define what is mapped into which sort of thing. With XML parsers, you have the DTD, or the XML schema, that fills in all the lovely things like the class attributes and other things that the DTD authors have defined as fixed values or fixed attributes or so forth. With Markdown parser, we don't have that, unfortunately. So the code that does this parses Markdown and converts it into XML. That needs to actually fill in while it's doing the mapping all the class attributes, because we actually need those. That also means we don't have validation. So if we don't add a separate layer for doing the validation, it's really easy to read invalid Markdown files and then just let them flow through the pre-processing steps, and at some point you notice things don't work. So parsing Markdown is not difficult, but when you compare it to parsing XML, XML already has the concept of a DTD, for example, so it's a lot easier. In the future, we will probably add an easier way to define the mappings, because I noticed that while I was implementing lightweight DITA's Markdown processing or Markdown mapping, and then the old one, they don't actually fulfill all the needs that someone might have, and I'll get back to that. The other one is I'd like to add validation, so that when you parse a Markdown file, you'll get validation errors. So we have support for outputting Markdown too. So you take DITA and you convert it into Markdown, which sounds weird, but it can be done. So we have support for generic, the GitHub flavored, and the Gitbook flavor. We could also add the PHP's flavor and alternative Markdown flavors that exist. We don't currently have support for mDITA output, which is yet another flavor of Markdown. I'll skip the implementation details for now, but we're using a out-of-the-shelf Markdown parser called FlexMark Java. So I didn't write my own Markdown parser because we can reuse existing things. And for example, FlexMark Java is used by various authoring tools for showing, for example, a preview of the Markdown, preview in HTML, for example. So we are fairly certain that the technology we've chosen works. So we wanted to make this plugin available now because we think people want to use it, and it will be easier for people to actually start contributing to the lightweight DITA subcommittee, giving them feedback if they're able to test some things out for themselves instead of thinking about it and then not necessarily noticing all the issues. The code was already there. I wrote it 2 years ago. It's the same people doing the work, so there was no communication gap between me and the other person. This is also one of the things in Open Toolkit where I'd like to test an alternative plugin development model. If you go to the GitHub repo for Open Toolkit, you won't actually find the Markdown plugin in there. It's in a separate repo. And the thing I'd want to experiment is that we'd have this sort of a release train. Open Toolkit is released every 6 months, but that doesn't mean I can't release the Markdown plugin and updates to it every 3 weeks if I want to. I can release every 3 weeks, and then whenever Open Toolkit is released, we'll just pick the latest stable one and ship that. This is something I've been trying to convince Robert to do for the other plugins. He's not so keen on it. Because when you separate a plugin development cycle from Open Toolkit development cycle, some things may become possible. For example, we could have improvements to the PDF plugin that still work when you try to run the plugin in OT 1.8. Right now we can't because we always ship the latest one and nothing else. And that way we could have, for example, long-term support versions of plugins, but it's actually quite unlikely unless someone with funding is able to provide that. But this is sort of also an experiment about how we manage the plugins inside the project. Okay, then yeah. This was a meh image. So then there's DITA. All of the things I just discovered actually apply to HTML5 too. And one thing that sort of dawned on me while I was doing this is that because Markdown can already contain HTML, I already have an HTML parser in the plugin, so we can really easily support HTML too, and the DITA. We currently support only one mapping from HTML5 to DITA, because I haven't come up with an alternative yet. That's basically the reason. There's already sort of a standard one. But I am not too sure that this will be the next big thing. I think people will start using DITA instead of DITA. So in the end, it doesn't really matter what your syntax is, because your authors will spend most of their time thinking about what they're going to write and fighting with people who don't understand that they should get the information yesterday and so forth. So the syntax itself isn't really important. So you could, I suppose, pick a syntax you want. If you like authoring in Markdown, use that. If you like XML, use that. No one's ever wanted to author HTML5 by hand or with an editor, so I'm not sure that that's even worth the effort. But Markdown is a really popular format. The problem is that if your goal is to take a subject matter expert that knows how to write Markdown, you tell them, document this, send me the results. And then they send you Markdown files that are not valid DITA topics. Like they don't use the headings correctly. They stick multiple tasks into a single, under a single heading, because with tasks you can only have one set of steps and so forth. It might not actually work. And in the end, if you want to do anything that's remotely complex, like use keys, properly use keys or conrefs, then you should probably revert to using XML DITA. Because while Markdown is a language that can be extended, if everyone extends it in their own way to add support for things like conrefs or filtering, there's no interoperability. And I suppose interoperability and content reuse is one of the key points of DITA. So Markdown is easy to write, but that doesn't mean it's the best solution for everything. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Yep.
One question about HD, I know nothing about it, but what would you do with script tag? Just get the unit, or you actually leave it in HTML?
Okay, so what do I do with script tag if I have HDITA? Script tag is the tag where you stick JavaScript into. Well, if you tell your subject matter expert to write DITA, and then or some content, they give you an HTML file that contains JavaScript, that will probably not work in PDFs. So you just have to ignore some things. The two other languages that we've decided to add in addition to XML DITA are Markdown and HTML. Both contain things that DITA can't handle, especially scripts. So I don't have an answer for that other than leave it out. Yep.
Question. Markdown this time. What do you do with pipe characters? Or actually properly put a pipe character into Markdown. How do you go about doing that?
Well, with pipe characters, you're talking about tables, aren't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Who likes to write tables with ASCII art? Hands up. Okay, apparently developers like to write or draw tables with ASCII art. That's good for them. Okay, thank you.
Just want to mention if anybody's curious to hear more about the applications of the Markdown support, we'll be talking about that on Tuesday, and not so much from a developer standpoint, but like what sort of publication scenarios are enabled by that, when do you use what, which variants and things like that. So I'll talk about that at the conference if anyone's curious about that.
Did everyone hear that? So come to the DITA Europe conference to hear more about the actual usage of Markdown.